All right, welcome back from our tea break. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Our next presenter is telepresence, so distance. We talked about distance the last time, and she's coming to us from Minnesota. And Jothsna Harris, if you look at her bio, she works with climate generation. And I don't want to take up too much of her spiel that she's going to give us. It's a Cedar Legacy Foundation. And she's going to talk to us about climate stories and coming up with your own climate stories as a way of communicating and reaching across the aisle to move towards action. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jothsna.
Hey everybody, welcome back from break. I am hoping that you are re-energized with your tea and biscuits that you had, because I know it's afternoon there. So I will try to keep it in for you. So my name is Jothsna Harris, and I am the Public Engagement Manager at Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy. And I'm excited to join you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm happy to save some carbon and make a good use of technology by joining you virtually today. So over the next half hour, I'm going to share with you how Climate Generation, a Will Steger legacy, has been utilizing storytelling as a powerful tool to advance solutions to climate change. And before we begin, I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about who we are. So we're a nonprofit located here in Minneapolis, and our mission is to empower individuals and their communities to engage in solutions to climate change. So we work with a wide variety of audiences. We work with youth, mostly high school age youth, to support them in action projects that they're leading in their schools, and also to build empowerment as their young leaders. And we also work with educators to teach climate change in the classroom. We work with the public to help normalize conversations about climate change and to build public will for solutions. And we also work with influentials. And by that I mean grass tops leaders, policymakers, businesses, and so on like that. So I'd like to ask who's in the room there today. So by show of hands, how many of you are from the United States? Okay, great. And then what other places are represented in the room today?
Do we have anybody that wants to speak up?
Shout them out.
Canada.
Shout them out.
Iceland?
United Kingdom.
Portugal. Austria.
Italy.
Brazil?
Switzerland. Japan.
Bulgaria.
Okay, I think we got everybody.
Wonderful, welcome. It's so great to see. I think I've heard about 10 different places around the world. Is that right? Well, of course, no matter where you're from, we are seeing the imprint of climate change all around us. So where you're from, please raise your hand if you think that climate change feels normal to talk about. Okay, so I'm seeing a few hands. And maybe, you know, it's complicated, right? It probably depends on your circle of friends and family and, you know, where you live specifically and the political climate there. So here in the United States, we are facing some challenges with that. And really, when we look at all of the many reasons why we should be talking about climate change, One statistic that really struck me was that according to the Yale Climate Communications Center, in the United States, 70% of Americans believe that climate change is happening, and even that it will cause harm to future generations. But 2/3 of Americans say that they never talk about it. So we know that there's a disconnect here between people feeling concerned but lacking the confidence to talk about it. So I believe one of the most important things that we can do to address climate change is to talk about it. Because after all, when we talk about it, that influences public opinion, and public opinion drives decision making. And what we need is a cultural shift. And to really reframe the way that we have been talking about climate change, we really need to strip away all of the layers that divide us and find our shared values. So I'd like to turn it over to you by asking you a question, and I'm going to invite you to share your answer, and we're going to see your answers actually populate on the screen. So the question is, what do you value most about your community? And to share your answer, you can go to use your smartphone or device at menti.com, and you'll use the code there. And then you can share your answer with us, and then we'll see it populate on the screen. So what do you value most about your community? So you can take a minute to do that now. And the way that this works is that the more people that say a similar word, the bigger that word will appear on the screen. Awesome. So can you all see that on the screen?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. So we have safety, nature, health, friendliness, living in a safe place, connection, accessibility, inclusiveness, belonging, knowledge, collaboration. Awesome, thank you. And so values are often at the heart of the stories that matter to us. So I'd like you to keep this word in your mind as you think about what your own climate story might be. All right, so at the core of our work at Climate Generation is the power of personal narrative. And how many of you know who Will Steger is? Got some hands. Great. So as some of you might know, we were founded by Will Steger, who really led with his own values. And Will is a polar explorer, an educator, and a climate change advocate. And for over 50 years, Will Steger has inspired tens of thousands of people through his remarkable accounts of climate change on our polar regions. So we know that personal stories on climate change are important, not only to help us better understand how it's actually showing up in our lives, but also as a way to move people to solutions. I'm going to play a video about Will.
name Will Steger now stands listed among the great explorers of the world. The National Geographic Society ranks Steger with aviation's Amelia Earhart, polar explorations Robert Peary and Roald Amundsen, and the ocean's Jacques Cousteau, and has named him its first explorer in residence. Discovery began early for Will. At the age of 15, he took a motorboat from Minneapolis, Minnesota, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. A quarter of a century later, after putting up numerous first descents of mountains around the world, Will turned his attention to his first love, the frozen polar ice. He led the first confirmed journey to the North Pole by dog sled without resupply. 3 years later, he led the first dog sled traverse of the continent of Antarctica. The International Trans-Antarctica Expedition was a torturous 3,471 miles in 7 months. 5 years after that, Will led the International Arctic Project, a 1,200-mile first ever crossing of the Arctic Ocean from Russia to Ellesmere Island in Canada. In 2004, he led a 6-member team on the Arctic Transect, a 3,000-mile, 7-month educational expedition of Nunavut, Canada. And Will continued his educational effort with his Global Warming 101 expedition in Baffin Island above the Arctic Circle. His team included 3 Inuit members, Sir Richard Branson, and 6-time Everest summiter Ed Beesters. As Will Steger matured, the dreams of being the first to summit or the first to raise a flag on a piece of terra incognita became less important. As Will saw more, listened to the stories of remote, nearly forgotten people, he was seized with an urgent calling to tell their stories.
Global warming in this region is really being played out on the sea ices. The heat from the greenhouse effect is being absorbed. About 80% of that energy is absorbed into the oceans. Oceans are warming, of course, and we're getting a later freeze up each year.
My name is Theo Ikumak. If I look at the youth that we have today, their future is quite bleak with their association with the environment as it is right now. Looking at our 10-year-olds, if they get to be my age, is the ice going to be there? Maybe not. Are the glaciers going to be here? Maybe not. Their way of life will be so different in that Inuit culture will have to be rewritten down the road.
Hello, Canadian Geographic. I'm Will Steger, and happy International Polar Year. I've traveled in the Canadian Arctic for over 45 years. I've traveled over tens of thousands of miles by dog sled. And here at Copenhagen, there is a lot at stake for the Canadian Arctic. And what is at stake is the sea ice in your glaciers. It's a very serious thing that we reduce our carbon level very quickly. And the carbon levels are going to be determined here at Copenhagen. So Canada has a lot at stake here, along with the rest of the world, but especially your native Dene and Inuit population here. This is what it's all about right here at Copenhagen. Thank you. I do think part of our mission and the foundation, of course, would be to make sure that the policies are adhered to through education and involvement. It all has to do with social engagement. If we're more socially engaged, we're going to be in good shape. The time is crucial, absolutely crucial. We can't even wait anymore. We're way behind schedule. We used to say we had 10 years. We don't have 10 years anymore. We got to move right now.
Great. So that video, of course, was published in 2009. As you saw, that was Will was greeting people at the Copenhagen International Climate Talks. And, that was 10 years ago now. And in the film, he says 10 years from now, will we be facing the same challenge? And that's a bit unfortunate that we're in the position that we are. Just a bit earlier, you all had a chance to share what you value about your community, some of the values that Will has really from an early age, adventure and curiosity, the human stories. And when he was a boy, he would barter and trade for National Geographic magazines. And that really fostered in him this interest in travel and adventure and challenge, which kind of led him to the places that he went. And I think that people are so enthralled by Will's story and other stories by explorers like that is because really what Will was facing was uncharted territory in this hostile, unfamiliar terrain with a treacherous landscape. And it's really not so different from what we are facing now. And what Will and other explorers have shown us is the perseverance of the human spirit in the face of extreme challenges. So we can draw from that to look for courage. And Will would actually look for the areas that had never been crossed. He would seek out the areas of resistance because he believes that there is a power in being vulnerable, in leading from the edge, because that's where the most growth actually happens. To the next slide. Okay, there we go. So it wasn't that long ago that we relied on the experiences of just a few people like Will to paint the picture of climate change for the rest of us. And when Will was telling his story, it was really at a time when not that many people were talking about climate change, and they were definitely not talking about it from this personal eyewitness perspective. But unfortunately, the times have changed, and climate change is here. It's all around us. It's not in some distant future or in some distant landscape. And given the increasing imprint of climate change on our lives, with extreme weather events, flooding, heat, sea level rise, wildfire, it is becoming clear, increasingly clear, that we are all eyewitnesses. It's not just a few of us. We are all eyewitnesses, and we all have a story to tell. And for a long time, the way that we've talked about climate change has been from a scientific perspective alone. And while the science is essential, it's actually our stories that place facts and figures into context. And what research tells us is that information alone is not enough to move us to change our behaviors. So to actually shift behavior, we need to get out of our heads and into our hearts and connect climate change to what we care about. And it's easy to understand, especially here in the US, why it's so complicated to talk about it, because there are scores of opinions in the media, lots of misinformation, political polarization. We're in a time now in the United States where even the science has become politicized. And the latest reports show us that we need urgent action. And while it's important to acknowledge the fear that we feel, fear does not motivate us. So how do we actually shift the conversation? So it turns out that the secret to talking about climate change is really not about how well you talk at all, but about how well you listen. And stories do that. Stories elicit listening and empathy and compassion, more of what we need in the world right now. And when we seek to have conversations with the goal to build common ground and seeking to listen and learn from the other person, building trust and rapport before bringing in the facts, in turn, I strongly feel that you will be more likely to be heard. So Climate Generation has been elevating people's stories. We've been coaching hundreds of people each year, citizens, farmers, business owners, faith leaders, youth, to find their climate stories and to share them as a way to normalize conversations about climate change. So we elevate these stories by sharing them at live events, submitting them to local print media, radio stories. We coach people on how to tell their stories to politicians and attach a specific ask to that story. And then we also have an online storytelling collection at Climate Generation. Okay, so here are some reasons why we know storytelling works. Storytelling is a compelling way to bridge the science and the solutions. Sharing stories of community members in a local place, speaking to that sense of place, helps to create a peer influence and a normalcy in talking about climate change. And then we also know that when these stories are told from a personal perspective, they help elicit an emotional connection to and a relevance to our lives, which is incredibly important when you're talking about a complicated issue like climate change. And after all, stories are really how we make sense of the world around us. They are how we remember things, and they're how we think. So what is a climate story? A climate story is a story about you. It is told from your own personal experience. It could be about observations that you have seen over your lifetime. It could be a story about a pivotal moment, or grief that you have felt, or hope or solutions, or simply why you care about climate change. It's a story that's descriptive, it's personal, and makes an emotional connection to the issue of climate change. Other reasons why we know storytelling works is because everybody is an expert in their own experience. Very few of us, maybe some of you in the room, are climate scientists, but most people aren't, so we don't feel confident speaking from that perspective. But when we share our stories, it is really an equitable approach because we are all experts in our own experiences. And then facts are easier to dispute, but it becomes much more difficult to dispute when somebody is speaking about their own experience. And then what I have found is that, interestingly, most people would say that they don't have a climate story, but once you start digging and asking questions, people find those connections. So whether that's through farming, or faith, or thinking about future generations, there's really the evidence all around us that show that we are deeply connected to this issue. And it makes sense because climate change is not only a planetary crisis. Yeah. We as humans are really at the center of it. And we actually don't have that many spaces to acknowledge that climate change is a very emotional issue, and that there are a whole range of emotions that we feel when we're dealing with climate change, from grief to hope, and starting the process of acknowledging and dealing with it can actually prompt healing and help other people understand the issue of climate change in a much broader perspective. And then perhaps most importantly, what I have found is that stories can help people feel empowered. They can help people realize that their voice is important and that what they have to say matters. And this image is a picture of a youth that we work with who is sharing her climate story with the governor of Minnesota. And she was very nervous. But for her, her story, the process of uncovering her story prompted an aha moment and helped her realize her why she's engaged in this work. And it can also help elicit that in other people as well. And I'm gonna play a quick climate story for you so you can hear an example of that.
Support for ClimateCast comes from Bank of America. As one of the largest global financial institutions, Bank of America is in a unique position to help society transition to a low-carbon economy. Bank of America N.A., member FDIC.
I'm NPR Chief Meteorologist Paul Huttner. This is ClimateCast.
My name is Chris Heater, and I live in East Bloomington, Minnesota. I am a wilderness guide and had the blessing and the curse of finding my passion at a young age. So ever since then, I've been finding ways to continue to guide trips. So I've worked for a number of organizations and started my own business back in 2001, running wilderness trips for women, and then taking what I've learned outdoors and speaking about it to companies and nonprofits. For many years in the beginning, I would guide trips and we might have a storm now and again, and it would not be too big of a deal most of the time. But now, if you're out for a week, almost more often than not, if there's a weather event, it's going to be big. And we're out there in tents and canoeing or whatever, and it's just a much, much bigger deal and something to take more seriously. And in the dog sledding world, man, more often than not now, we're spending time shoveling snow from the woods onto the trail so that there's enough snow for the dogs to run. And that's been evolving and changing in a really creepy, awful way. Also watching the habitat change as you go north. Used to see moose, it was pretty regular when you're out in the woods, and now I'm not sure. It's been 10 years because they're having to move north. They're struggling from the tick-borne diseases that get carried by deer and get dropped off there. So in small and big ways, from big weather issues to the tiniest little animals and insects have really, really shifted and are continuing to, which is pretty scary. We got to move past this feeling of shame and just paralysis into saying collectively we can make a difference. It's going to be a group effort to make this change, right? So one person at a time. What I believe is we will protect that which we love. Guiding a Utah trip, canoeing in Utah on the Green River in 2001, a custom group of 14 women for 2 weeks on the Green River. It happened to be 1.5 weeks after 9/11. Planes were just starting to fly again, and everyone had to choose again to come, and we all did. Because of 9/11, I think our senses were pretty heightened. But instead of fear, what we shared most was wonder and connection to each other, to the canyons, and to ourselves. Each day that we paddle, you travel deeper into the canyons. Always someone saw or felt something that touched us deeply. Terry Tempest Williams' book, Red, Passion and Patience in the Desert, was our guide. Reading from it every day, reinforcing what we were experiencing, all shades of red, the smell of the water, the rocks, the raptors soaring high overhead. On a hike, I remember seeing a patch of red sand and just having to lie down in it. The sun lit the crystals in the sand. It was like stars twinkling. Pretty soon everyone was in the sand, arms stretched out. What I felt there, and especially on that trip, was reciprocity. This glorious place with water the color of coffee with tons of cream, this place welcomed us as we, in turn, reveled in the beauty and sparseness and power of the canyons. I swear there was a connection, a reciprocity that continues to inform my work, my delight, and my passion to help awake others and help them experience their wild side so that we can come to believe it matters and it's noticed even by the rocks, the water, the sky, all of it.
That's ClimateCast this week. With thanks to Climate Generation's Talk Climate Institute, I'm NPR Chief Meteorologist Paul Huttner.
So there are many different examples of climate stories that I've heard that are really have helped me to understand this issue well beyond the graphs and the charts that are usually used to tell the story. And so we need both. We need both the science and the stories of the traditional ecological knowledge so that we can better understand this issue. So I imagine that you all have a climate story, whether you realize it or not. And so I'm gonna leave you with some storytelling tips. And I also invite you all to work on your own climate stories, and you can submit them to us, and I'll tell you how to do that in just a minute. Some things that help to make a strong story is to hone in on a specific moment and to really describe that in detail. And that helps to really bring the hearer of the story into it. So using sensory imagery as much as possible, you're using your 5 senses. What did it taste like? What did it smell like? All of those things. And then making sure to add in your feelings and your emotions about it to tell people what it felt like to be in that place or to have that conversation with a loved one, or what it was like to experience that impact. And interestingly enough, the more that you describe your story, a specific situation in great detail, the more universal your story becomes. So I don't know if you heard Chris, who shared that story, talk about laying in the sand and how the sun reflecting off the sand crystals just made it remind her of the stars in the nighttime sky. Like, I can relate to that even though I have never been to the Green River in Utah. Adding in climate facts really helps to ground your story and make it more compelling. So here in Minnesota, we have a lot of winter enthusiasts, winter recreationists who like to ski and participate in those kinds of activities. And one fact that can help ground those kinds of stories are that Minnesota's winters are warming faster than any other state in the nation. So that really helps ground somebody's story that's about that. And then your story does not have to end in a hopeful way. It does not need to be wrapped neatly in a nice conclusion, but you can use your story as a tool. So if you are talking to a politician, you can share your story and attach an ask to it. Or if you're sharing your story with a friend that you'd really like to prompt along and getting involved in action on climate change, you can say, hey, I'm going to this event on Saturday. I'd like you to join me. So it can be a way to be able to talk to people and a tool for engaging people in solutions. So if you'd like to share your climate story, you can do that at climatestories.org. And those stories come to me, and even if it's in rough shape, I can help you edit it. And then we usually ask for a couple of photos. You can also record a podcast, audio recording on your phone, and then send it to us. And then I'd love to know if you have any questions for me now.
We've made them all storytelling experts now, so they're good.
Awesome. Well, I expect to see those climate stories then.
Hi, I'm from New York City, and I live downtown Manhattan. We were hit by Hurricane Sandy, and we had the Red Cross there. And I often don't think of the big cities as having, people don't think about like New York City as being hit by climate change. And I'm wondering if you've gotten a lot of stories that are also coming from an urban perspective as well as, more of an outdoor culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that we're all coming to this issue from different places and perspectives and backgrounds and histories. So our stories are as diverse as we are. So when we kind of push beyond the nature stories and understand that climate change is impacting people, and so there's a large variety of different types of stories, and we do have some stories from Hurricane Sandy as well. So all of those are important to be shared.
All right, well, thank you, Jothsna. It's been wonderful, and we're going to have a breakout session where I'm going to use a lot of your advice to work on some of those climate stories, and hopefully we'll have some to submit to you.
Awesome.
Julia or Sophie, you want to talk about Julia's breakout sessions?
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
That's up to you.